The Callisto Protocol has the potential to be something really special here. Dead Space and Resident Evil often trade blows for what is my favorite horror franchise, and Dead Space is mostly able to do that with the first and second game alone. So when I heard the co-creator of Dead Space was working on a new game, I was glued to info, trailers, the works. I knew exactly what to expect from this game. And so did a lot of people who really like Dead Space. The problem is, a lot of the people that don't really replay Dead Space the same way they do something like Resident Evil seem to have completely forgotten Dead Space's fundamental gameplay loop and design. It's even more embarrassing for some of you to do this because you literally just played Dead Space. But we're going to get into that in a bit. The bottom line I'm trying to get across is that if you're really into Dead Space, then you'll recognize Glen Schofield's style of horror. It's very much about the gore, very much about frequent combat, and very much about starting from nothing and ending up capable against all odds by the end of things. Enemies that do insane damage, swarm, and pummel you if you're not careful. That's what Dead Space was, and that's what this is. Unfortunately, that has somehow confused people who haven't played in a while, I'm guessing. Unless your name is Susie the Sphere Hunter, and you literally just played Dead Space, but somehow someone must have bonked you over the fucking head, and you're suffering from the most severe case of short-term memory loss I've ever seen. So this video is going to be my own thoughts and opinions on the Callisto Protocol, from the perspective of a huge Dead Space fan that plays these games all the damn time, but it will contain spoilers, as I will be running through the game from beginning to end, and discussing the combat, the mechanics, and what I think it does and doesn't do well. But before that, I need to address the elephant in the room. I'm going to be referencing the Sphere Hunter's review here, sprinkled throughout this video to discuss examples of criticism that don't make sense to me. Because she's what's considered to be the most mainstream sort of horror game channel, and she has put out one of the most ridiculous misrepresentations when it comes to what this game was expected to be that you could possibly watch. To the point where if I couldn't see with my own eyes that she had made a video on Dead Space, and you had a gun to my head and said, "Do you think she played it?" I'd be like, there's no fucking way she's touched a single game in the Dead Space franchise. I don't watch the Sphere Hunter that much anymore because I think over time her takes have gotten worse and worse, and there is no better example of that than this specific sentence right here.
So the first thing you're undoubtedly wondering is, hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all. The Callisto Protocol is a beat-em-up third-person shooter action game with light, and I mean light, survival horror mechanics.
I'm not going to sugarcoat what I think here. This is without a doubt one of the dumbest things she's ever said about a video game. It's one thing for her to have an opinion, she's entitled to that, but this is an objective statement. And I bullshit you not, it makes me believe she may need to head to the local pharmacy and pick up some Prevagen. This statement wasn't but 1 minute and a few seconds into the video, and it was so unbelievably painful to listen to, I had to turn the video off and come back to it later. So what I'm going to do here is play you a few clips from some encounters in Dead Space 1 and the Callisto Protocol. And I want you, with your functional eyeballs, to take a look.
place looks older than the rest of the prison.
Hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all. The Callisto Protocol is a beat-em-up third-person shooter action game with
Down initiated.
third-person shooter action game with
Lockdown lifted.
Susie, what the fuck did you play? Because it couldn't have been Dead Space. Did a crackhead on the street sell you a game, tell you it was Dead Space, and then hand you some shit like crying is not enough? Someone please get that lawman on the phone. I think someone pulled a fast one on her and sold her something bootleg. What the hell are you talking about? Imagine if I described every horror game this way. The Evil Within is a third-person shooter and a stealth game with light horror mechanics. Resident Evil 4 is a third-person shooter and a kung fu fighter with light horror mechanics. Do you understand how stupid this sounds? Every now and then I do get a little curious what she thinks of a new game, and this particular video is being pushed in the algorithm hard. And being that I like the Callisto Protocol, it is always interesting to see who does and doesn't agree with what I think, who does and doesn't like what I like. That sort of thing gives this whole gaming discussion a variety. My problem is not necessarily that she didn't like the game and I did, but that she has a painfully ignorant understanding of what she has just played when it comes to both Dead Space and the Callisto Protocol, and then misrepresents the comparison. And because she's so mainstream, people see this boneheaded ass take and then parrot it because people are influenced by the stuff they watch. Like, I'm listening to her complain about crawling through vents here.
with canned animations. Jacob does the most crawling I've ever seen in a game. He crawls through vents, tunnels, flesh tubes, and literally shit to get around this linear prison.
And I'm like, Dead Space 2? When you say,
Hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all.
you're not speaking to people who have played one game in the series. You're speaking to people who have played the entire trilogy. And especially because a lot of people cherish Dead Space 2 in particular, you need to have your shit together. This game is similar to Dead Space in most ways, but it also has its differences. And depending on which Dead Space you assess, the level design is actually pretty similar.
The game is extremely linear and chapter-based.
No fucking shit, Susie. There's this other game that's chapter-based and linear. Can't quite remember the name. How weird. Totally wouldn't be similar to this Callisto game, though. Now, when it comes to the criticism of the game's linearity, criticism of the QTEs, the set pieces, or whatever, let's give her the benefit of the doubt and assume she hasn't played Dead Space 2 and 3. Actually, never mind, I can't even do that. Because she fucking dressed up as Ellie in the video, so I know she's played all of these. Dead Space 2 in particular is literally a straight line from start to finish. Full of QTEs. filled with crazy ass set pieces, and is considered by a lot of people to be the best game in the series, myself included. I mean, you can say, well, Glen didn't work on Dead Space 2 and 3. But he fucking made the IP. Common sense says, of course, he played them and was inspired by what they did with his original work. That is plain to see right down to the damn flying through the air set piece, where you need to dodge debris. When he talks about comparisons to the Callisto in interviews, he's not just talking about comparisons to Dead Space 1. Because he took bits and pieces that he liked from the entire trilogy. This new IP takes those ideas and remixes them a bit, so that you feel and recognize the style, but it's still something new. Susie, on the other hand, here is acting like she's brand new to this shit, and wants Callisto to do weird stuff that Dead Space didn't even do. She's like,
imagining what it would be like filling out this place's floor plan on a map that didn't exist, checking off rooms I've cleared, marking upgrade shop locations, and locked doors.
And I'm like, when did Dead Space ever make you do that? Let me explain to you how Dead Space's level design works, for those of you who aren't aware. Typically, when a Dead Space 1 chapter starts, you step off the tram, and someone calls you up and says, Isaac, here's a bunch of shit that needs fixing. But also, you need a keycard to unlock this door. So you need to fix everything in this very specific way, and then we'll unlock the final area, you'll do a thing in there, and then you turn right back around and head back to the tram. Think of Dead Space's level design as being a square, but on every side of the square is a little tunnel that you can go down that leads to a very specific room. That's about 4 sides, right? Now imagine sides 1 and 2 you can do in any order on the checklist, but you have to do them both to unlock side 3, which finally unlocks side 4. Then you head back to the train and do it all over again. It's not like Resident Evil or Silent Hill where you find something that's locked or broken, and then you explore a bunch of rooms trying to figure out what might open or fix it. Every single chapter in Dead Space tells you exactly what is locked or broken in the level, the very second you step foot off the train. But she's here complaining about there not being a map, like you were running around in Dead Space confused where to go, when from the moment you start the level you click a little button down on your stick, and I bullshit you not, a holographic line shows up and tells you where the hell to go. I know how people who often replay Dead Space 1 and 2 because they love these games can relate to what I'm about to say here. The only time I've ever opened the map in a Dead Space game is when I accidentally confused the control scheme between the two games. If you're not fucking up and opening the map, you're fucking up and pressing the other game's heal button because the reload buttons are different. Now, she may have said she didn't like that Dead Space was designed that way in her Dead Space video, but it doesn't change the fact that it was. So, expecting this game to suddenly cater to her personal favorite thing is just weird. Like, I don't understand why you would be disappointed by that. But that's enough on her for right now. Mostly everything else in her video is just her opinions, and the fact that she thought the guy who made a game that constantly locks you in rooms and throws waves of monsters at you until you kill them all was about to make Silent Hill 2 or some shit. And she's entitled to that opinion, however odd it may be. Most of the other takes I've seen from people that don't like this game, in articles specifically, are on the opposite end of the spectrum. They say that it's too much like Dead Space for its own good. Also, one more thing to add before we move on, but I checked out that indie game she recommended towards the end of the video. While it looks like it's a cool game if you want to play some early PS1, PS2 style survival horror, suggesting people play that instead, simply because Callisto is a game that wasn't really made to be what you like in horror games, is so fucking tacky, dude. But what I will do is take certain clips or sentences from this video that I find to be absolutely hilarious for all the wrong reasons.
Hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all.
And sprinkle them around for comedy. But what do I think? Well, I think it's a good game, a good start to a new IP by a new studio, but it's not perfect. And it for sure has some issues that we're going to touch on, but there's a strong foundation here for something really cool they can iterate on. For those of you who don't know, my favorite type of horror games are the kinds like Resident Evil 4 to Revelations 2, The Evil Within, and Dead Space. These IPs are what I consider my big 3, the golden era games, where if you locked me in a room and you said you can never play any other game, but you can play these over and over and over again, I'd be perfectly fine. The Callisto Protocol, I can safely say, has become that fourth, but they still have a little more polishing to do before it can reach its full potential. But it's not going to do that listening to people who don't vibe with it. It's going to do that listening to people who do vibe with it, but still have good, well thought out feedback to build its own strong, solid fan base for its own style of horror, because it's a continuation of the Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space style of action horror with its own twist on it. And it's not for people that want to water it down into being Resident Evil fucking 1. Striking Distance Studios has something really special on their hands, and I do like it. So what I'm going to do now is take you through this game from beginning to end, discussing it in a semi-structured but less professional way, as you can tell, because that's the style I really like. We'll discuss the good, the bad, what they can improve on for the people that like it, not the people they were never going to please, what they need to get rid of, what they can refine, the whole works. To prelude that, though, we have to talk about this game's fucking horrendous launch.
Whoa. Wasn't that something?
Okay, that's clearly a graphics glitch. Especially on PC. This might be one of the worst PC ports I've played in recent memory. You'd have better luck kicking Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali's asses at the same time than you would have trying to get this running properly, even well above the recommended specs. Even now, it doesn't matter what resolution you set it to, from medium quality and up, the game will drop frames into the 40s. Even with ray tracing turned off at 1080p, there's basically nothing you can do. The upscaling in this game is also worthless because it gives you no real frame rate increase outside of like 4 or 5 frames per second. It's just botched. At launch on PC, the game stuttered like crazy, thanks to shader compilation. But that's really an Unreal Engine 4 issue. Every single game I've played on that stutters like this on PC. So it's something I came to expect. What I didn't expect was, just like I said, how badly it runs besides that. Every single port but the PlayStation 5 version has issues. Xbox is missing graphical features. PC has performance troubles. PC, in fact, is constantly running out of VRAM. Mostly when you have ray tracing on and it's just optimized like sewer water. That's probably the biggest thing that shot this game in the foot, launch-wise I mean. This obviously led to review bombing on Steam, because of course it did. And this has allowed people who didn't like the game to just go screenshot the initial launch day and start a hate bait campaign where they go, "See, the game is awful, everyone hates it, please give me views." When in reality the reviews are mostly positive but still a bit mixed, and the game is a bit divisive. There are some people like me that really like this game, and then there are others where it's really not their cup of tea. Then you have people like Synthetic Man here, who spent his entire career just whining and complaining and moping about every single new game that comes out, and clearly should just quit the fucking hobby at this point. So opinions like his are always copied and pasted, and are just going to be worthless to anyone who isn't a miserable 13-year-old. I know Steam reviews tend to be kind of useless too, due to how easy it is for man-children to just review bomb a game for the smallest things, but in this case it was warranted. They need to know that this game's launch was not cool. They really botched what they needed to be solid. When you do something risky like the Callisto Protocol and change up the formula, your initial reactions are gonna be mixed. And you're gonna lose some people that just wanted your old shit again. It happened to Resident Evil 4. It happened to The Evil Within. But if you have balls, and you stick to your guns and you refine what you're doing based off of actual useful feedback, you will more often than not replace whoever you lose and find a strong new audience as people learn and understand your game's mechanics better. But that, like I said, depends on a strong launch with no real performance issues. If you're doing something different, someone still getting the hang of the game's mechanics is probably already dying a lot, and probably feeling a little frustrated and salty. And then to have to deal with this game's frame rates dipping into the low 10s. I don't know what the fuck just happened. While you're being swarmed in a game this punishing is not a good look. But now that we've discussed the performance, which is one of the biggest issues, let's discuss the game. The Callisto Protocol starts us with a woman, exploring the damaged remains of Europa. A planet with people housed here just living their lives. The place is a complete mess, and everyone seems to be dead, killed by some kind of virus. We learn from the news broadcast that the woman in question is a member of the Outer Way, which is being labeled as a terrorist group. We then zoom out to our man of the hour, one Jacob Lee arguing with his co-pilot Max. Jacob and Max are cargo pilots, flying a ship by the name of the UJC Charon, and they've been hauling things back and forth from Callisto to Europa for their most recent job. Max believes there's something off about the job because of the terrorist attacks, and because of all the security and strict regulations they've been running into. He's also worried they might have something to do with what's going on. Jacob, on the other hand, argues he doesn't really give a fuck, it doesn't really matter, because they're being paid big bucks for the job. The ship pings a warning light, and when Jacob goes to check it out, he realizes that they've been boarded by the Outer Way, as well as the woman in question from the newscast. Desperate, he locks the bridge, and then opens the airlock and tries to eject the cargo out and everyone inside. But the woman decompresses the ship by shooting the window out, and the ship goes critical and crashes back into the surface of Callisto. When Jacob wakes up again, Max is mortally wounded, and Callisto security boards the ship to assess the situation. Jacob tries to explain what's going on, but the warden of the local prison orders both him and the woman, who survived as well, to be apprehended. We're introduced to Captain Ferris, played by the GOAT, Sam Witwer, a great actor and a Star Wars legend. In addition to roles like voicing Darth Maul and Emperor Palpatine, this is fucking Starkiller from The Force Unleashed. Before we had Cal Kestis, we had Starkiller, and those were glorious times. Here, he's the star in any scene he's in. He reminds me of Voss from Far Cry here, and that throughout this game there's a very clear psychotic frustration with him. A frustration with the protagonist that he's doing his best to keep suppressed. But whereas with Voss, he's typically frustrated with not being able to kill Jason no matter how hard he tries, and feeling like he's being replaced by him, Ferris's frustration comes across as him being really more upset that the warden won't let him kill Jacob, even though he wants to because he feels like he's better than everyone else, and Jacob is just kind of in the way and irritating, and really irrelevant. Jacob, of course, is like, guys, what the fuck, I just took a job to be a cargo pilot. But it's all in vain. They drag on with Dr. Mahler, and she brutally fits him with the core module. Ooh, I know that shit hurt. He passes out from shock, and here we get a dream sequence that will only make sense to you on a repeat playthrough. When he wakes up again, he finds that the prison has gone to shit before he can even really get situated. His door is also unlocked due to system failure, and he's free to roam around. He passes by a prisoner in his cell by the name of Elias, who tells him he has a plan to get out of here, and that he'll let him in on it if he heads to the control room and lets him out. He also gives him a good old prison shank to use, and Jacob heads over to the control room. When he gets there, he's jumped by some escaped inmates, and we get a QTE sequence that introduces us to the game's combat and dodge mechanics, where we make short work of them before the game has us put it all into practice on our first enemy of the game. These mutated humanoids will make up the basis for the majority of the enemy types in the game. There is some criticism to be made about the fact that the enemies are so humanoid, but I think this is actually a really good design choice. Whereas in Dead Space, monsters were really sort of sharp and slashy, the monsters here are more brutal, physical, and hands-on. The horror in this comes from the fact that the monsters are so humanoid without any real sharp bits. For the most part, they swing at you and try to grab you. There are a couple of them that try to bite you or infect you in some way, but most are trying to beat you to death or rip you apart. Now, for some reason, the monsters being so humanoid are magically a problem all of a sudden, and supposedly not that scary, but I again can only assume people have recently hit their head and don't remember much, because what the fuck are these then? There's only a couple of creatures in these games that don't just look like feral humans. Callisto's difference is that whereas when these enemies are typically done, they use some sort of sharp object or weapon and try to stab or slice at you, and the Callisto, they don't need it. They are superhumans. Failed experiments at superhumans, but still, they can rip you to shreds, overpower you in a matter of seconds. The bigger ones will knock Jacob clean off his feet and take you right from green to red. And as we'll touch on later, if you let yourself get swarmed and they start getting behind you as they realistically would, you will get punished and you will be destroyed. That brings me to the most divisive thing about this game thus far, the combat. Minus stasis, Callisto will still let you do all the stuff you did in Dead Space. Shooting, melee, kinesis, which is now called grip, the whole gang. The spin on this is while in Dead Space it was really like 95% shooting, here this is more of a 50-50 split, a mix between the two. Ammo is not plentiful, and trying to line up shots close in this game, when an enemy is in your face, is a surefire way to get yourself hit, if you're not good at the game yet. So the Callisto wants you to juggle between the two and they trade off of each other. Ranged weapons can keep enemies off of you for a brief period and decrease the likelihood of getting hit, but enemies in this game are beefy and tough and they can take a lot of shots to put down. Eventually you will either run out of ammo killing them all, need to reload, or need to save some. And that's where this trusty ass get the fuck off me stick comes into play. This has to be one of the most satisfying things to hit something with that has ever been put into a horror game. You can upgrade it throughout the game to do more damage, absorb more damage on block, do extra hits in your combo, break limbs on block, which is one of the most useful things you can do because outside of taking off an enemy's limb, it basically breaks their defense and you can go on the offensive and attack again if you're quick enough. The more you upgrade it, the color on it changes to reflect being more lethal. The thing about it though is that you can't just walk up to something and start whacking away. They're superhumans. And they're not stupid. So 9 times out of 10, you'll need to dodge their swipes first. This is done by moving the stick in a direction either left or right, with Jacob bobbing and weaving out of the way of whatever they just threw, and mentally calling them a little bitch while he does it. Think the dodge system from Resident Evil Revelations if it actually fucking worked 90% of the time, and not just 50% of the time. The catch, you can't dodge in the same direction twice. Apparently this aspect has confused some people, and I don't know how, because right after this you get a tutorial pop-up that's literally a wall of text telling you everything you need to know about this mechanic. That's not the game's problem, that's a you problem. What is the game's problem is that this doesn't always work correctly. Take a look at this clip here, for example. Now see, I've gotten my ass kicked like 50 times by this boss, so I can tell you that I know he'll attack up to about 5 times. So here I am bobbing and weaving, and Jacob just decides to stand there in the middle of his swings, regardless of the fact that I just input the method to dodge again. This game is very punishing of your mistakes, and this can be a life or death situation. This kind of thing should not be happening. There are other times where you'll go to dodge and Jacob will do the animation, but the game decides the enemy just hit you anyway because their arm clipped you during his dodging animation. If this happens while you're on low health, again, you're fucked. You dodged right and still got clobbered. But worst of all, when it comes to slip-ups, is how this game handles multiple enemies. Take another look at this clip right here. What the fuck was that? So essentially what I think happened is that 2 enemies hit me at once at the exact same time. But obviously I can't dodge twice at the exact same time, so no matter what I did, I was gonna get hit. And this sub-boss is a one-hit kill, so I got fucked for no reason. Now while I think a lot of the people complaining that the combat falls apart when multiple enemies are on screen are just kind of shit at the game and frustrated. So in the modern age of gaming where we let every man-child leave a little salty review on Metacritic or Steam or some shit, these are the kind of complaints you see, and it's really just a skill issue. What happens in these kinds of moments is not. That was me getting robbed. When you successfully dodge something, Jacob should have invincibility frames throughout the whole animation. Not enough to where he just doesn't have to dodge again, but enough with some balance to where you still have the penalty of fucking up and letting yourself get hit a second time, and we'll have to accept that sometimes, even if you do dodge something, you just straight up can't swing again because your positioning is bad, but not enough to where you're just getting cheated. Getting swarmed in general, like I said, you can try to avoid, and a lot of times you are just being challenged to play smart and deal with that, but it's not always perfect, and eventually it will become unavoidable. This becomes a problem when, say for example, you just shot an enemy that's crawling on its legs now, but you're still dealing with enemies that are standing up and swiping. Well, chances are, if you just dodge the standing guy, you can't see that the crawling guy just swiped at you too, so you for sure just got hit. You also can't really dodge when enemies are hitting you from behind, so that, again, is just a free hit for them. To kind of help with enemies getting behind you, the game will often have the enemy grab you and throw you towards a direction that's facing them. But if you are around any traps, they likely just threw you into one and killed you before you could even do anything. Again, there's refinement that can be done here. In my opinion, I think really something here is missing. Maybe another gadget similar to stasis. But given the prison setting, something electrical, like maybe a stun function on the grip, makes more sense. Something that when you aim it and shoot it, will stun a specific enemy. But if you use it after a dodge, would trigger an AoE stun that can help you get a little breathing room, and give you a little time to fumble with and select a different weapon, because we'll get to it, but that specifically can take a while. If turning your back and trying to run from enemies wasn't a death sentence, this wouldn't be needed. But with something like this, we can still have that pressure of being overwhelmed and accountability, and still be skillful to get out of sticky situations like this. Outside of that, Jacob also has both a strong attack that's slower to wind up, but is better for crowd control, damage, and knocking enemies into hazards, that are, by the way, littered around levels that are extremely dangerous to both you and enemy you knock them into, but also a stomp. The stomp is a bit weird in that if you knock an enemy down and you send them flying, you can't really stomp them, but you can stomp an enemy that's crawling on its legs. It's like, again, why can't I do both? The hazards, on the other hand, are a great idea and mostly work well with the previously mentioned grip, but the issue I have with them is that outside of the grip and heavy hits, there's no real way to kite these enemies into these, especially the ones placed on the wall. And because enemies are constantly on your ass, you can't really break away and sort of run towards one of these either. You can't swing the baton in that direction and knock them towards it. You can't dodge in the same direction twice, so you can't sort of strategically dodge right a couple of times to try to knock them into something on your left or vice versa. And that's a real shame. Something that could use some improvement. I think the decision to not have to time your dodges and not let you dodge the same direction twice is working against the game in this regard. Because it would add more strategy if, like in Revelations 1, you had to time the dodges, but could dodge whatever direction you need to get a better position to set something up. The window to dodge wouldn't have to be super strict, but it should require you to be paying attention. This would also make the next mechanic, the block, a lot more viable and useful. See, if you still suck at dodging, and let's keep it real, a lot of the people who say this game's combat is bad do suck at it. Up until this motherfucker makes them learn it. I know I did. I was getting my ass beat, absolutely destroyed for the first half of this game, and raging. Dude, what the fuck? Then you can hold back on the stick to block. The trade-off is that you take a bit of damage. You can upgrade your stun baton to take less damage, but there's always going to be a bit of chip damage here. Right now, there's no real reason to use it outside of the counterattack that's tied to it, But if we had the option to choose the riskier dodge, but the safer but still damaging block, this could go a lot deeper. All the strategic dismemberment you remember from Dead Space, though, still here. But you're doing it for a completely different reason. See, because the dodge mechanic is so forgiving, there has to be some punishment for you fucking it up. And boy oh boy do they punish you hard. Jacob has the durability of a cheap condom. And all bosses, with the exception of one, will almost always one-shot you. So to deal with that problem specifically, gameplay-wise, when it comes to non-boss enemies, you need to shoot off their limbs to minimize the chances of them attacking you multiple times. I say minimize because you might think they only swing once with the arm that's left, but on rare occasions they may swipe again. This is something that the game doesn't really tell you, you just kind of get a feel for it and figure it out. Also need to deal with tentacle mutations. Certain enemies, when they take enough damage, sprout tentacles that you'll need to shoot or melee in some type of way to keep them from regenerating and getting stronger. Again, adding layers to the game's combat. Because if you're getting swarmed and some of them start mutating, the pressure really starts piling on to decide who to deal with first. When all this stuff works and it really starts to click, the game is so much fun to play. Bobbing and weaving, knocking the biophage upside the motherfucking heads, then popping off a few quick shots, or going that good old-fashioned traditional route of just straight up shooting it until it's dead, playing with the grip mechanic. Everything here is just as fun as shooting off necromorph limbs in Dead Space 2, and then shooting the blades back at them. Or lining up stun shots in Resident Evil to do a melee attack and blow a group of enemies back. Rinse and repeat for hours and hours because that shit just never gets old to you. That's what this game is supposed to be, and it does that extremely well. I don't know how some people can say they've been closely following and looking forward to this game, but then can turn around and say they were completely blindsided by how combat focused and action heavy it is. When not only are its predecessors the same fucking way, but the pre-release footage made it clear as day that this game was going to heavily emphasize melee, because that is a huge portion of the gameplay that they showed pre-release as well as in all the marketing material. If some of you were the kind of people who saw that and were like, oh wow, I didn't expect this, when the game launched, I'm not gonna hold my tongue here. You're kinda fucking stupid. Also find it hilarious how the emphasis on ammo conservation in melee combat will suddenly ruin a horror game for you, when you'll then proceed to suck Silent Hill 2's dick all the time, even though it basically does the same thing. Only the melee combat in Silent Hill games is about as interesting as store brand white bread. Silent Hill 2 has a guard button that you will never use, that you will 9 times out of 10 forget even exists. Because what you do the majority of the time is run directly up to an enemy, quickly assume the position, and then mash away on X for the next 5 to 10 seconds, stun locking it until it's dead. But Callisto's combat is somehow repetitive. I can't be the only one here that has a functional brain and sees the fucking hypocrisy, the favoritism, and blind selective nostalgia from a lot of these supposed horror game YouTube channels. Speaking of Silent Hill 2, Jacob ain't no damn James Sunderland. This dude is about that life, and I absolutely love how capable he is. He's not Chris Redfield, punching a motherfucker's head clean off their shoulders, but he's not as worthless as the majority of horror game protagonists tend to be either. He's not gonna trip and fall on the floor in fear. He will fight back, and he will do whatever it takes to win and survive. I find that much more relatable than the Stars team from Resident Evil 1 literally tripping over themselves because one zombie is backing them into a corner or something silly. He has easily become one of my new favorite horror game protagonists, right next to Leon Kennedy or Isaac from Dead Space. Because he might be scared shitless, but he's not afraid to man the fuck up and fight for his survival with a paperclip if he has to. This idea also plays into the game's original setting as being part of the PUBG universe before that was scrapped, but that's something I'll touch on as we get closer to the end of the story, which we should really get back to. Jacob heads back to Elias and tries to warn him that something isn't right. He's just killed something that looked human, but wasn't. But Elias, having not really seen them, tells him he's just seeing things, what the fuck ever, and tells him they need to stick to the plan and get out of here. Now the gate is stuck, so Jacob can't get back to where he was. But Elias has a plan for that, enables a link to his core, and tells him he'll guide him through the prison where he can open the gate manually. While Jacob is traveling around, Elias finally runs into the biophage for himself and tells Jacob they might need some better weapons and that he should head to the armory and see what he can find. To do that, though, he needs to get past one of the security droids that are set to kill any prisoner they see. This is the only real mandatory stealth sequence in the game, and I'm glad that's the case because I fucking hate it when games force it on you by taking away all your weapons or something stupid. It feels completely artificial anytime a horror game does this. And I'm looking directly the fuck at you, Resident Evil 8. And don't think you're safe either, the evil within, because you did this shit twice. We sneak past it and can look around and explore a little. And about here is when I want to stop and take a look at this game's level design. See, I am sick and fucking tired of the constant whining and bitching about linear games and how they're too short. Because there's this forced trend of making every game expansive and open world, open-ended hub worlds, and blah blah blah. And any game that isn't exactly that is outdated. Whether or not you prefer one or the other is your business. But every game does not need to be some 500 plus hour padded out RPG where I have to search every nook and cranny in a room for a lug nut or some shit. So that I can craft the same exact gun I already have, just better because it's level 3 and the next area is level 3. I'm tired of that shit. I am sick of that shit. I prefer linear, focused, meticulously crafted and detailed chapter-based games that keep shit simple, take you through an experience. And that is what this game is. That is Glen Schofield's style. That is what Dead Space was, as I've already explained, and I'm glad he didn't stray from that. No, this isn't a fucking open world game, sorry. His brand of horror is based off of Resident Evil 4, not Resident Evil 2. You're not going to be looking around trying to figure out where some key goes, or trying to open every locked door while looking at your map trying to figure out where to go next. You didn't do that in Dead Space. You won't be doing it here. A game being linear is not some objective flaw in its design, it's your preference. I prefer a game like Callisto or Dead Space 2 where it's very specific and very obvious where you have to go. You go from point A to point B, and along the way, you experience the game. More open-ended games aren't bad to me. I can play by something like old school Resident Evil's rules, but it's not the type of game that I prefer or mostly look for. And watching games come out and be docked by certain creators on this platform because nobody told you they were going to be some immersive sim like Prey, but that's what you want every game to be, is so fucking tiring. It's why I don't watch people like Luke Stevens anymore, because if I have to hear this man whine about a game not being Deus Ex or something again, I'm gonna rip my damn ears off. For as linear as the game is, it's not like it doesn't reward you for exploration. It's not like it doesn't reward you for going off the beaten path. You can do exploring away from the intended way to go, to find chests filled with useful items like computer parts, like the semiconductors from Dead Space, health, ammo, or Callisto credits, this game's currency. So it's not like you can't ever explore a side door or something. For example, I'd imagine most people like me pick up the second firearm you get, the skunk gun, in this room here, like I did on my first playthrough, because the game hasn't really gotten you too comfortable with looking for side rooms to fish around in, or paying attention to other places to put the fuses in, outside of the main obvious door. But if you are observant, you can actually get the skunk gun earlier in this room here. This is a game that will reward you for going off the main path, but it isn't going to make you to progress. Through exploring, you can also run across secret rooms built on Callisto, from a much deeper plot involving the secret organization that controls this whole thing with technology, well beyond what is accessible to the general public. To Black Iron Prison, its ruler, Warden Cole, is to be feared, his word is law. To his bosses, he's just another employee in the branch that is expected to deliver sufficient results. These guys, whoever they are, make Umbrella look like chumps. You guys remember how at the end of Dead Space 2, we heard back and forth from a secret society in control of EarthGov that was extremely unhappy about what happened on Titan Station? And how Tideman had fucked up everything? Remember how Dead Space 3 happened and absolutely nothing was done with that setup? Well, here's that kind of plot actually taken somewhere. But it's mostly, again, just like Dead Space. If you're opening a door in Callisto that isn't the door you're clearly supposed to be going in, it's because you're looking for supplies. The reason you're not looking for keycards in this game is because there is no need for them in most cases. You look for dead bodies to cut the core hardware out of them. Authorization to get through doors and all that is handled through the core software that all the guards and inmates have installed at the back of their neck. That's called consistent world building and attention to detail. It's hard for inmates to escape if they can't grab any sort of keycard off a guard, because that guard has to be physically present to even get the door open. And everyone's location is being tracked through their cores. The only reason Elias is able to pull off this escape is because when the Callisto Protocol is activated, most of the prison systems reboot, fry, and or malfunction. Again, I don't know why the fuck some of you thought you'd be running around in the streets of Silent Hill looking for town keys to open the damn back door to a house or something. But there's not one singular way to make a horror game or design a horror game. And this clearly was not trying to be that, and neither was Dead Space. While exploring around, you can also find audio logs similar to how you could find in Dead Space, giving you a deeper understanding of what's going on around you. The issue here is that for some reason you can't listen to the audio logs while moving around. You have to stop what you're doing. You have to go into your menu, listen to the whole log, and then you can go on about your business. Or you can use some secret Discord tech that I picked up, start the log, then pause the game for it to play while you move around. This baffles me, because Dead Space had this locked down from day one. When you picked up a log, it automatically played while you carried on. Hell, in Dead Space 2, they let you choose to play it once you picked it up, or you could ignore it. Not only that, but unlike in Dead Space where the audio logs are listed by chapter, if I remember right, here they're listed by name, so if you don't remember the name of whoever's core you just picked up, good luck figuring out who the fuck it was. I don't know what happened with this one. This should have been a no-brainer. Jacob eventually makes it to the armory, but it's already been looted, outside of the stun baton I talked about, that he trades his crowbar he started with for. He opens the gates and heads back and up to the watchtower, where he runs into Captain Ferris, who he unsuccessfully attempts to sneak by. And we get what is probably Sam Witwer's best scene in this game. And this moment is so good, I'm gonna let it play in full.
Good moves. You. How the fuck did you get in here? You think I got time for this shit? Okay. Let me see if I got this straight. You crash here, and then this whole place goes to shit. Oh, 5, 2, 1. Look at me when I'm talking to you. What'd you do? Huh? You can tell me. Are you different? Are you special? Why'd the warden want you alive? I told you. This is my kingdom. It's all yours.
He and Elias then rendezvous in a safe room, and we get introduced to this game's store, its weapon printing and upgrade system. This is where you'll sell items, and like in Dead Space, when you find a schematic, this is where you'll bring it to get a new weapon. This is also a good time to talk about this game's inventory or lack thereof. For about half the game, you're stuck with 6 inventory slots, up until you get your suit, at which point you're given another 6. That's about 12 total, and it starts to fill up very quickly. Nothing in the game stacks besides ammo. Dead Space games have about 25 item slots total, to keep this from being annoying. But in Callisto, you will constantly come across things like grip packs and things you want to pick up but can't. To pick it up, you have to drop precious ammo. Especially because the parts are extremely important to sell and upgrade, you will end up having to drop a health syringe or a full stack of ammo, and you'll likely feel really fucked up about it. Now, of course, this is very survival horror-ish, but with how much this kind of horror is about the combat, I think inventory space this strict was a mistake. Honestly, for a horror game, if we're being fair, Dead Space gives you too many inventory slots. To the point where by like chapter 4 or 5, you're typically stacked with so much ammo, health, and all that you don't even know what to do with it besides throw it in the safe. Something that especially happens with health packs, but it gives you a good amount of ammo to stack. Here's what I mean. I don't want to dive too much into the weapons yet. I'm saving that for when we get to our second official non-missable weapon. But for example's sake, the hand cannon, your trusty workhorse weapon, stacks up to 12 rounds per slot. The skunk gun, 8. Riot gun, 8. Pistol, 15. Assault rifle, 60. Now compare how your bread and butter weapon, the hand cannon in this game, only carries about 12 rounds per slot, versus how the plasma cutter in Dead Space carries 25, or how the riot shotgun carries about 8, but the force gun, its younger brother in Dead Space, carried what, 15? The assault rifle rounds stacked to 60, whereas the pulse rifle's rounds stacked to 100. Do you see what I'm driving at? For all the stuff the game wants you to pick up, the per stack ammo counts are a bit too rough and too low. Especially because there is no safe anymore. It hurts especially hard having to drop something. Great for a horror game focused on picking and choosing your fights and knowing when to run away. Bad for a horror game about combat and battling against swarms of extremely lethal enemies. This fix is literally as easy as doubling up the ammo counts, which in turn would fix the problem of that portion of people whining like insufferable little bitches because the game's focused on balancing melee with shooting. The simplest way to do this and still keep the game's creative vision intact is to, from medium security and below, double the ammo counts per stack. That way people who want to just play Callisto space with zero variation or remix to the formula can still mostly do that. But create a fourth difficulty, high security. That is what medium security is now, and from that point up, drop the ammo stat counts back to default the way they are now. You know, for people who have a set of balls. Grip packs should also stack, because that tends to be the first thing I drop. And for fuck's sake, Glen, give me a quick recharge option for the grip packs, because if there is one, I can't find it. If you run out of grip juice, and trust me, you will, all the time, you're just stuck there. You kill something and frantically try to open your inventory and reload the grip before something else pops out of a vent. I think this was the same way in Dead Space 1 for stasis, but by 2 you could press one button and recharge it, and there was always recharging stations around. Now the plan here is for them to find a ship. Elias needs Jacob because he's a pilot, but they also need to hack the system on Callisto to drop a ship from orbit to come rescue them. The issue is that none of them know how to do that. So Elias looks through the files and locates a prisoner with the skills that can. Unfortunately, said prisoner is in the SHU maximum security area, so getting there is going to be a bit of a drag, especially for Jacob. Elias's core will get him past a lot of doors that Jacob can't get past, so he'll have to guide Jacob there a different way. We're going to gloss over the fact that he could literally just open the doors and let Jacob walk in right behind him because video game, I guess. Also here, have another homage to Dead Space 1.
Hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all.
Jacob eventually comes across a security guard wearing a grip unit for himself, and the default loadout is complete. I will say that the way that they introduce grip to you is pretty poor. They tell you how to use it, you grip the enemy, and you'll probably throw him into some glass or something and realize that didn't do jack shit. By the time you try to grip him or another enemy again, you'll likely run out of grip charge the second you try to pull them over to you. And he'll just plop to the floor next to you, leaving you confused and wondering if this thing is even working properly, or if it just fucking sucks. Once you kind of get used to it and start experimenting with it though, it's a lot of fun. There's some really deep stuff you can do with it to help you get the edge in combat, but they do not give the best first impression. They could have introduced it with some sort of hazard or something around, so you can get a basic surface level understanding of it. If there is a hazard in this room, I can't find it. While we have some more downtime here, let's talk about this game's fear factor, and whether or not it's scary. Some people find the Callisto scary, some people don't. You can say that about just about any game or film ever made in the horror genre. It's all relative to personal preference. So somebody saying whether something is or isn't scary in their review is a giant ass nothing burger to me. Some people are scared shitless of Dead Space, and some people aren't. Resident Evil, you get the picture. Think about it. I don't know very many people scared of someone like Freddy Krueger, but there are. Me not finding Freddy scary does not necessarily make Nightmare on Elm Street a bad series or any less enjoyable to watch or experience, because the heart is still there. And that brings me to this whole horror game gatekeeping that a lot of these YouTube critics do. It's why I don't watch a lot of them anymore. If I'm watching one, it's typically a select handful with some sense. Let's loop back to that dumbass opening statement from Susie again.
So the first thing you're undoubtedly wondering is, hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all. The Callisto Protocol is a beat-em-up third-person shooter action game with light, and I mean light, survival horror mechanics.
Now I want you to give me the definition of survival horror. No, not your goofy-ass personal take on survival horror. No, not what it is to you or what it should be. But an objective definition, an objective denotation that encompasses every single game labeled a survival horror game without fail, without question, and without confusion. You cannot. Do you know why? Because survival horror at this point has been slapped on just about every single horror game that has come out since what? The early 2000s? Let me ask you a question. Amnesia and Resident Evil 4 are both called survival horror. Does anyone with a functional brain think Amnesia is the same kind of game as Resident Evil 4? Hell, Resident Evil 7 isn't even the same kind of survival horror game as Resident Evil 8. Doom 3 is a survival horror game, and so is Outlast. Does anyone think that Outlast is the same kind of survival horror game as Doom 3? Matter of fact, here's 30 seconds of Doom 3.
I just don't know what to do. What are these things?
Here's 30 seconds of Outlast. You want to tell me how Condemned Criminal Origins is the same kind of survival horror game as Metro Redux? Or do you think it might be time for everyone as a whole in the industry to stop using the term survival horror as a blanket term when we just mean to say horror? Because of that, it's not a game dev's fault that some of you have some stubborn, nose-turned-up attitude about what survival horror should be. This is why I like Avalanche Reviews, because he's at least self-aware of all this nonsense, and judges horror games off of what they are, not what idea he had of the game being in his head, because he couldn't understand what he was seeing in gameplay reveals. Now, he says some dumb shit too, but he at least owns it and is like, yeah, sometimes I say something dumb, it is what it is. And because of that, I can watch his stuff and be like, hey, alright, I like your style. He's aware of when he's just being an old fart, and it's charming. Or better yet, go watch Boulder Punch. Boulder, in my opinion, is one of the best channels on YouTube for horror, even when I don't agree with him, because he never says anything that is just fucking dumb. Listen, if you're someone with a full-time job or something, and maybe you don't have time to be informed on what every game in a genre you like is or isn't going to be like, that's one thing. But when you play games in the horror genre and reviewing them is your job, I don't think it's too much for me to expect you to be a bit more informed on what you're reviewing based off of what is being shown to you. Because if I replace the term survival horror with any other genre, the shit that comes out of some of your mouths would just sound ridiculously dumb. Like, imagine me saying, oh, Mirror's Edge is disappointing as an action-adventure game because I expected it to play like Shadow Man, a game I played when I was 5, that along with Super Mario 64 and Tomb Raider, shaped the initial vision of what action-adventure games are about. So that, to me, is an action-adventure game. That would sound fucking insane. And I know some of you are probably upset about the fact that I'm grilling your precious little waifu, but others will resonate with what I'm saying. A man with some goddamn sense can only listen to this shit for so long, and for so many years before he turns into this, and that eventually turns you into this. And when you think that can't get any worse, that disease grows into people who use terms like true horror, real horror, or something along those lines. This reminds me of those cringy ass dudes who say stuff like, this is real metal, this is real rap. And these are usually people you find thrown off a balcony at some party or something because they're just so fucking annoying. What people typically mean by that is that they primarily like psychological horror, or atmospheric horror. Which would be fair as a preference if you didn't make yourself sound like an idiot anytime you try to convey that. Imagine saying something that dumb about horror movies because you have a specific kind that you like, and everything else isn't real horror and just shouldn't be made. You know, you prefer movies like Jacob's Ladder that are slow burns, so movies like Wrong Turn or Hostel, they just aren't allowed to exist. They're not real horror. That would sound fucking stupid and that would be boring. The same way horror games become boring if they all fell into the same category like some of you people want. Not boring because classic survival horror is boring. Not boring because atmospheric horror is boring, but because the idea of nothing else being allowed to exist or it's disappointing is boring. So boring to the point where back in the day when that's all horror games ever were, the guy who plunged it into the mainstream got so fucking bored he just straight up stopped doing this shit and took all his future horror games in a wildly different direction than the ones he initially made. Listen, the best thing about horror is its versatility and its broad spectrum. There are horror games out here with something for you no matter what kind of horror you like. And to be honest, if we're keeping it real, in my opinion, atmospheric horror and restraint in a horror game is just as cheap and paper thin as jump scares or gore is. It all eventually wears off and is basically meaningless on a repeat playthrough when you know absolutely nothing is going on down this hallway or in this room. Or you know this thing jumps out and goes boogity boo at this particular moment. Or you know the only way something can brutally kill you is if you fuck up and die, but you've gotten so good at the game at this point that it doesn't matter. No matter what you prefer, it all will eventually fade. Personally, for me, you can scare me with jump scares. You can scare me with atmospheric horror, but both of these only work in one playthrough for me. After that, the best thing a game can do to attempt to scare me is exactly what Callisto does. Overwhelm me and make the punishment for failure extremely severe with gore. What never fades in a horror game to me is fucking up and getting backed into a corner by swarms of enemies, panicking and trying to figure out how to get out of that situation. Callisto is even better about getting overwhelmed because you can't really heal mid-combat. It takes a while. So when you're being overwhelmed and you see his health go down into danger, you start freaking out. Because all it takes is one more wrong move and you're treated to a really painful way to die. That's the kind of thing that remains scary to me. When I was a kid, it wasn't just enemies like Dr. Salvador or the Garrador or Plaga B that scared me in Resident Evil. It was how they killed you that was the scariest part. That's why while Silent Hill's imagery can be scary to me, having probably the best atmosphere you can have in horror games in my opinion, realizing that until later games if something kills you, you kinda just drop to your knees, kinda takes away from the mood. That's why Dead Space 2's Needle Machine will always scare me more than some spooky atmospheric hallway ever can. It's the only kind of thing in a horror game that can still get me on repeat playthroughs. And once you get good at horror games, regardless of whatever kind, the real fun is really from seeing yourself get better at the game because you know the game's mechanics, or just running around, playing around, and blasting things. They all sort of become action games once they stop being scary. This is why gameplay and combat are king in my eyes, even in horror games. When whatever method you have used to scare the audience is worn off, what is keeping them coming back to play your game? For me, at least, it's the combat. Even old school Resident Evil knew this, and still knows this up until this day. And that is why the games give you super weapons to run around and play around with, or include things like raid mode and mercenaries. For people who are into the combat side of things too, hearing that Callisto is a throwback to this era right here is exactly what we wanted and expected. Because we know the era that Callisto and Dead Space were both inspired by. Callisto fits right at home next to these games, but it also puts its own spin on that design philosophy with up-close and personal gameplay, similar to Silent Hill games. And keep in mind, for those of you that are into this sort of thing, from what I can tell, Callisto is getting some sort of horde mode DLC, where you hold out as long as you can, and I cannot wait, man. This is why stuff like raid mode and mercenaries is so popular in Resident Evil games. Where are people that really know Resident Evil's mechanics and enemies like the back of their hands at? If they're not the speedrunning type, they're typically in raid mode or mercenaries. So when you say Callisto is combat heavy, sounds familiar. When you say it's about balancing melee with gunplay, home sweet home. Movement is a bit stiff and heavy, par for the course. Dodge focused, music to the ears. You're free to say it's not your thing, yeah, but when you sit there and act brand new to all of this stuff, like it isn't already in a good portion of horror games, to the point where you say shit like, oh, Callisto doesn't get to be a horror game. Yes, some of us are gonna point at you and laugh and then get a fucking headache because you sound dumb. Susie in her Dead Space review likes to glorify the triumphant defiance that was bucking the trend of Resident Evil and going in a more action direction, but that's a pile of horseshit. Dead Space does the exact same things that Resident Evil 4 did. Literally right down to the action. It just tried to have a better atmosphere while it does it. Whereas Resident Evil 4's atmosphere wasn't really that spooky until the village hit nighttime and a handful of caves or labs. That said, this game's approach to horror isn't perfect. For starters, yes, jump scares are tight, but a lot of them have to be unpredictable to work. There are a lot of really good unpredictable ones in here, like going through an area, coming back through it a couple of times, And then one time when everything seems fine, something grabs you while you're trying to shimmy through. Or one of my favorite ones in the game.
Poor bastard.
But there are a few where I'm like, how could he think I wouldn't see this coming? Where the camera just slowly zooms in towards something and then Jacob gets grabbed. Use them as much as you want. I like jump scares, but catch me off guard with them, man. I know he knows how to do it. He did it in Dead Space with the drag tentacle or the brute window. And he does it here, but some of these are so obvious they can't really land. All 3 times Jacob has a dream sequence, he gets grabbed by Max at the end. All 3. Knowing the full story, I understand the significance of Max tormenting his dreams, but there is a real missed opportunity to use him to mess with Jacob during the gameplay, like Nicole would during Dead Space 2, or even use him in a more restrained, atmospheric way, like maybe catching him staring at you from different places as you play the game, or better yet, have Jacob argue with Max sometimes about how this is not really his fault, up until the end where he learns what he did to Danny. That would have made the ending land way more. In addition to that, what you have to understand about Glen is that this is the man who pushed hard for the OG Dead Space team to get the drag tentacle right, to the point where he cut out other things from the game just to put this in. They spent forever trying to perfect this moment, and used it about 3 times. It's a really cool moment, and I'm glad he did it and brought it back in Callisto. The issue is how frequently he did it here. One of these drag heads or little infection leashes will grab you when you turn a corner or open a locker or chest about 1,000,000 fucking times. That in of itself is a problem with its frequency, but to top that off, every single one of these moments does damage when it grabs you. It will kill you if you're on low health, and there's nothing you can really do to predict or prevent it your first playthrough. You will get grabbed and you will die on low health. These leeches, for starters, should only really do damage if they spawned in the world. If they came out of a chest or something, they should only kill you if you fail the QTE. They're clearly here more for shock than challenge anyway, and I think that sort of balancing is fair. As for these drag heads, I think they're just used way too frequently. He should have, in my opinion, stuck to the rule of 3 here, but to increase the tension, everyone that grabs you could pull from an increasingly close distance. There's a couple of these grabs where they grab you from so close, I start getting really nervous that I barely made it out of that situation alive. And that's perfect. Continuing on, Jacob and Elias free the prisoner who turns out to be Danny, the woman who boarded his ship. She traps him in her cell and blows off their plan, and Jacob gets locked in and transported elsewhere thanks to a code red lockdown. And again, we'll have to take an alternate route using Elias's old plans to get to the location of the tram that they can both use to catch a ride to the hangar and call a shuttle. When he follows the plans and reaches him again at the tram station, due to station damage, they have to suit up and board the tram from around back outside. Bad news is, Captain Ferris ain't so dead after all, and he trolls the shit out of them by throwing him out of the airlock into the storm, which separates them and strands them. From this point on, you're in that sweet suit you see in all the marketing material. If you were low on health, putting this suit on will heal you back to full. And like I also said, upgrade your inventory. Elias activates his emergency beacon so Jacob can find him, as his suit is malfunctioning and the weather is killing him. Jacob tries to help him, but it's too late. He thanks Jacob for finally helping him escape after spending his life in Black Iron, and just then Danny shows up and brutally cuts out his core and steals his escape plans. She also tells Jacob to go fuck himself, he can't catch a ride with her, and he's forced to march towards the hangar on his own, in the storm. On the way to the hangar on foot, we eventually run into Danny again, who's getting swarmed and has the fucking audacity to ask for help. They put aside their differences and agree to work together for the time being, and Danny gives him her shotgun as a sign of trust. She's gonna fix up a vehicle while Jacob gets the main gate open. Now that we have our second non-missable weapon, I'm gonna go ahead and talk about the weapons as a whole. The hand cannon, like I said, is old reliable. It's the first gun you pick up, and you can basically use it through the whole game in your small arm slot and be just fine. Since there's no New Game Plus right now, this is basically the only game I can really discuss the alt fire on. It's an explosive shot that eats up to like 5 bullets. Next, there's a small arm shotgun, the skunk gun. You remember Shorty from The Last of Us? Think that. This thing actually impressed me the most. It starts off as sort of a double barrel shotty, but you can upgrade it to hold about 4 shells. I would speed towards that upgrade in particular because this gun becomes really useful after that. Last in the small arm slot is the tactical pistol. I'm gonna keep it real, this gun is kinda ugly to look at compared to the other guns. As far as using it goes, I mean it's decent, it's good for laying into something and keeping it back, but it's weaker than the other guns. They tend to give you a lot of ammo for this, but really I don't see a reason to use this over the hand cannon or the skunk gun. And the long arm slot, there's only 2 weapons. The riot gun, a shotgun that does exactly what you think it does, and an assault rifle, which also does exactly what you think it does, with the downside of being burst fire. We don't like burst fire weapons around here, get that shit out of here. Oddly enough, also, if you take a look at the way Jacob's inventory is set up, it feels like there's something that's supposed to be in the 3rd weapon slot for long guns that just isn't there, like it was cut during development or something. The catch to weapons in Callisto is that small arms use 1 frame, and long arms use 1 frame. So if you want to switch weapons, you'll need to wait for Jacob to switch frames and load the weapon's top onto it. You also have to wait for Jacob to holster either the long gun or the small gun to pull out the other one. Some people don't like this fact, but to me this is great. This adds to the horror and the tension. The gun doesn't magically appear in his hands like in Dead Space. So if you get caught lacking, you will have to fight your way out, or at least create some space with a boss to change weapons. If you need to dodge something and Jacob has already started to put the frame on or needs to reload, you'll actually cancel the animation out and be good to go. But if you dodge before he could, you have to do it again. There's a sweet spot and a bit of finesse to it. The control scheme to do all of this is admittedly a little clunky in the heat of the moment, especially if you just wanted to swap from primary to secondary, but forgot you don't really press the opposite side of the D-pad like you would in Gears of War or something, and accidentally opening up the weapon frame menu. It just becomes a mess. But they, I'm guessing, do it this way because if they did something like told you to hold the D-pad a certain direction for 1 frame or the other, you wouldn't be able to move while you swapped, which is a death sentence in boss fights.
Hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all.
Jacob gets the gate open and Danny picks him up. But instead of heading straight to the hangar, she drives them back to Jacob's ship, where she searches through the cargo that Jacob was carrying. She forces him to open the box, believing he had something to do with the Europa incident, but all she can find is medical supplies and he swears to her he had nothing to do with it, and knows nothing about it. And when he does, this happens.
Records show you made multiple drops right before the incident.
Me and a dozen other cargo ships.
Don't try to talk your way out of this. I know you were
I
involved.
had nothing to do with what happened on Europa.
There are 2 jump scares in this game that I really like, and this is one of them. 1, because this isn't really set up like the other ones are. It just suddenly happens. And 2, because it's story related. Jacob's core, for the most part, often acts up on him because of his guilt over Europa and his lies. So when he flat out lies to her face here, it's the reason this happens. And he's in extreme pain after he does so. Once you know that Jacob is lying, and have played through the game an additional time, it's the little neat stuff like this that you catch. With that issue behind them, Danny begins to soften up a bit on Jacob, and they finally get to the hangar and call for one of the ships to dock. But Warden Cole assumes control of the console and shoots the ship down, destroying the hangar and not only stranding them there, but sending Jacob plummeting off the mountain. This look familiar to you guys, by the way?
Hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all.
Oh, Susie. Jacob barely saves himself and passes out. Danny wakes him up so they don't get crushed and they escape into Arcus, an old mining colony that was quote-unquote abandoned and the foundation the Black Iron prison is built on top of. Danny wants to head back to Black Iron to get some answers, but Jacob is against this idea. Jacob doesn't give a damn about Danny's connection to the Outer Way or their Goody Two-Shoes quest for answers. He just wants to escape, but has no real choice but to go along with Danny's plan since they should stick together. Having to cross broken flooring and an elevator, Jacob gets separated from her again when he pulls an Isaac Clarke and falls down the shaft.
Isaac, slip it!
When he comes to, he's hanging by his feet in some wiring that barely, and I mean barely, saved him from being turned headfirst into a bursted watermelon. And we get introduced to the biophage miners. They've been down here a long time. Think the clickers from The Last of Us without the insta-kill. They're stronger and tankier, much more lethal than the Black Iron infected, but they are blind. Throughout these next couple of chapters, you are encouraged by the sheer amount of these things to try to stealth past them and make as little noise as possible. But it's not mandatory. If you're good enough at this game, you'll do just fine just wiping them all out. There are a couple of times though where the game just fucks you and have one of them pry themselves off the wall directly in front of you, but that's par for the course in horror games like this, to throw you off track and keep you on your toes so that you don't get too comfortable. I haven't really talked about the optional stealth because there's not much to talk about. You won't really use it much until this portion of the game, but it's solid. It works. You can approach an enemy from behind or towards the backside and stealth kill them. While I'm sure someone somewhere is crying about my immersion because enemies can't hear each other being killed even when right next to each other, or their bodies being stomped for loot doesn't make any noise, but that's clearly done for gameplay and balance reasons. Look how many of these things there are. And they don't walk on any real predicted path. It's all dynamic. They can all be spread out, or there can be a mob of them approaching you while you cower in a corner hoping they don't touch you while shambling around. After turning the power back on in the mines, and finding a mining train that will take him towards Danny's location, we get a really cool section of this game where Jacob has to fight off swarms of biophage on top of this machine while trying not to get torn to shreds. Hey, does this remind you of anything? I feel like there's a certain engineer that likes to stomp things, that also had to fight on top of something similar, with enemies climbing up the sides, and one gigantic death trap at one end.
Hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all.
Man, this stupid fucking sentence will just never get old, will it? When you clear out the fodder, we get introduced to the final trick this game has up its sleeve. The two-head. This thing is tall. It's strong, it's tough, and you can't just run up and whack it like you can most things in the game. You're gonna have to go old school to fight this. And don't mess that up, because if you do, you're gonna pay for it dearly. It's a one-hit kill. When it drops to its knees, that's when you run up and smack it upside its head. Which I think they could have found a better way to clue the player in on. Because if you're like me and you play a lot of Resident Evil, you're probably thinking, this is the Birkin fight. He drops to his knees. Time to unload as much ammo as possible. Only to realize when it seems like he won't die, oh, never mind, this is the Albert Wesker fight. And he's dropped to his knees. Fuck him up! After that, he'll get pissed and rip himself in half, and you do it a second time before he drops dead. Other than that, this is a classic survival horror type of enemy. Stay calm, stay focused, and try not to get too greedy when you have your openings, and you should be golden. They're like Dead Space brutes, but deadlier. Finally making it to the heart of the old colony, he searches around for Danny. But when he finds her, she's connected into some of the dead miners' cores, and freaks out on Jacob before she comes back to her senses and explains that this place wasn't abandoned. There was a biophage outbreak here, just like Europa and Black Iron. Any survivors were conned into gathering together by the UJC soldiers under the facade of help and then slaughtered to contain it. Jacob just barely saves Danny's life here from another two-head that I thought for sure was about to rip her head clean off. This fight, however, is where I think the game's boss and sub-boss combat starts to run into real problems. See, bosses one-hit killing you is all fine and dandy when it's just you versus the boss. But once they start introducing other enemies into these fights to keep you on your toes, like I pointed out earlier, the game can put you into some situations where you really can't do anything but get killed. But it goes beyond even that. Throughout this fight, there's a bunch of stuff littered around like breakable boxes for ammo and supplies to help you out, like explosive barrels, but it is so unsafe to try to disengage and run from a boss you will never be able to pick any of this stuff up until after you've killed it. You would think after it throws out some huge attack that you dodged, you'd be able to retreat a bit, but you can't. He'll swing again and he'll kill you. The only way to get any sort of breather against these things is if you drop it to its knees, whack it, and then run, scrambling to see what you can find before it gets up and gets to you again. I gotta repeat that while I like how relentless the bosses feel, I think again we're missing some kind of stun tool that can really get things off of you and give you time to disengage and look around. Danny, after having gained the miners' memories through their prototype core module, knows exactly how to reach the surface and get back into Black Iron. But they have to cross through a dome that she doesn't recognize since it was added after the Arcus incident. And we finally get some exposition onto what's actually going on here. So from what I understand, the initial biophage outbreak wasn't the UJC's intentional doing or mysterious organization's doing or anything like that. That kind of just happened on its own when they sent their miners here for resources. They accidentally woke an alien life form that began infecting them with its larvae. When the miners called for help, the UJC sent over soldiers and scientists to help figure out what was going on, and they killed it. Now, the UJC is corrupt on the inside. A lot of high-ranking individuals in it are part of what I'm going to call the organization for right now, since there's no official name for them yet. Not all of the UJC is in on this, but enough of them to call the shots. Those of you guys really into Dead Space's lore remember the Oracles? Those super agents that would just show up, that had supreme authority in tech, that regular EarthGov was just outclassed by? These are the same kind of agents that were after Lexine and Gabe's child back in Dead Space 2's DLC. Think the kind of organization that they would be working for. Once the scientists inducted into said organization realized that they had found something here that their superiors had been looking for, ways to speed up humanity's evolution process, evidenced by one infected miner in particular that possessed supreme intelligence, superhuman strength, agility, and didn't go feral like the other infected, they named that miner Subject Zero and contacted their superiors. Unfortunately, Subject Zero was killed by the UJC soldiers that were initially sent here, before he could really be studied. So instead of cutting their losses, they contacted their bosses again and asked them if they could set up a research base here, building a prison on top of the mines where they could use a basically unlimited supply of prisoners to try to replicate a Subject Zero. Jacob opens one of the containers, similar to the ones he's been shipping around with his ship, through a secret button on the side, and realizes he's really been transporting these larvae back and forth between scientist labs on Europa and Callisto. Europa being their main lab for study. Before he has time to reflect on what's going on and what he's done, he's interrupted by Captain Ferris, who's been watching a lot of JoJo recently, and has been searching for him to kill him personally. Both of the Phase 1 Captain Ferris boss fights in this game are fantastic. Everything the game has taught you about his mechanics come into play here, except for the grip that doesn't really work on him. And from a lore perspective, this fight doesn't even need to happen, and that's the best part about it. Warden Cole has given Ferris direct orders to leave Jacob the hell alone until he makes it to his chambers. Specifically so this fight can be observed by his superiors, and Ferris just doesn't care. This fight here is really supposed to be about one of humanity's most capable survivors versus something like Umbrella's Tyrant. If Umbrella didn't always fuck up and make them worthless to the point where they have to revise a new model. But that's neither here nor there. And everything about this fight fits this game's theme so well. But there's also this underlying hatred between Jacob and Ferris that makes this fight so personal. If you still suck at dodging in this game, I suggest you get real good at it right about now. Because if you do not, Captain Ferris is going to let you know the hard way that he does not like you very much. If you suck at reacting to whether or not an enemy has stopped swinging, so you keep swinging at the wrong time, don't even sweat it. Captain Ferris is going to teach you the hard way and let you know that shit wasn't cool. And get you trained up so that you can stop playing this game like a doofus. If you do not shape up, no worries. Captain Ferris here will stick around as long as it takes and beat you senseless until you do. This fight reminds me a lot of the whole Leon versus Krauser dynamic in RE4, where it's pure strength and aggression versus finesse and agility. And if you remember right, Leon is kind of in over his head there too. But as much as I like these fights, they're not perfect. Man, that is becoming a whole running theme for this whole game. This first fight especially. See, you may have noticed out of the corner of your eye there's health and ammo scattered about. You're never ever picking any of that up. You'll never even get the chance to look in any ammo's direction, because Ferris here is rushing you down like some goddamn K-pop fan. I like that you can't get any real time to heal either, because I'll tell you, seeing your health go from full to danger, and knowing you better get it together real quick because you're out of mistakes is extremely tense. But yeah, you get what I'm saying. This ammo around here is useless. Eventually, Danny gets the door open to escape, and they barely get away from Ferris. In the chaos, though, Danny is attacked and infected by one of the alien larvae. Don't mind the game here, it's just lagging and running out of VRAM for like the 8 millionth time. Look at this shit, dude. Glenn, what the hell, man? Obviously, Danny is upset, knowing she's a dead woman now. But Jacob promises her they'll find some kind of way to fix it, and they'll figure this shit out together. She's just gotta hang tight. So they continue into the prison through a back route, and realize the whole prison has been overrun and overgrown by the infection. So they plot a course for the warden's command tower, but get ambushed by security robots before they can even react, and Jacob is thrown back into his cell. A Mauler radios him to go to her lab at the heart of the prison. There she can get him to the warden and cure Danny. Obviously, Jacob doesn't really trust her considering she's the one who put that core on him, but he doesn't really have a choice. So he's just going to follow her instructions while she guides him through areas that are normally off limits to both inmates and guards here. Following these back routes, we can see that the scientists actually observe inmates from behind one-way mirrors, which is crazy when you think about the fact that they just have to sit there and watch inmates just rub one out and take notes on shit like that. That's wild. Unless that inmate looks like this. In which case, you know what? Go ahead and assign me to that one. I'll take all the notes you need. One thing I have to commend this game on for sure is when Jacob is captured, he still has all his gear. There's no dumb fucking run from a baby or hide for some dolls, mandatory stealth section that's good for streamer reaction compilations, and a one-time spook, but tedious anytime you want to replay the game because you remember you have to go through the most boring section of the game. Here, you're still playing the game you paid to play from this point on. Eventually, he does make it to Mauler's lab, where she explains a little more on what's going on. First, linking his core to Danny's to help him better understand what happened on Europa, and telling him, like I mentioned before, the organization is looking to replicate another Subject Zero, but nothing really seems to be working. All the test subjects just fail and go feral. Cole actually isn't the first warden to get the position, and they've all been running into the same exact problem. Cole got his position by promising his plan will help the organization get the results they're looking for. Instead of just wasting time the way something like Umbrella would do, through controlled, meticulous research, he decides to just brute force it by recreating the same sort of exact chaotic outbreak that initially happened to the miner, believing the extreme will to survive is what makes humans into prime candidates to control the effect and become the Alpha. Subject Alpha being a replacement for Subject Zero. She tells them that once his core is finished linking with Danny's, it'll all make sense. But irregardless, he needs to take the partial antidote for the infection she's created and extract a blood sample from the Alpha candidate, which has already been found. Once he does that, not only will he have exactly the sort of research data that the warden wants and is looking to present to his superiors, but he'll need to use it to save Danny by injecting her with it. When Danny wakes, Mauler leaves to accept her fate as being stuck on Black Iron, and Jacob and Danny start heading towards the warden's office. But Jacob's core finally links with Danny's, and through hallucinations he understands what he actually did and what really happened. The warden's Callisto Protocol is to unleash all the test subjects and the larva back into Black Iron prison, to search for his Alpha, and prevent anyone from escaping once it's begun. That's why he shot down his own ship, and why Jacob was taken to the prison anyway, because the warden was fascinated by his survival skills as a potential Alpha specimen. Back before that, Cole used Jacob and his ship to transport diluted, less potent samples of the larvae in secret compartments in the medical containers. And when Jacob and Max got curious and looked inside, they found the larvae samples but didn't know how to open them and didn't know what they were. They just got the feeling they were bad news. Jacob convinced Max to just keep his mouth shut and keep doing the job for the money. And then Europa happened, which was actually Cole testing his Callisto Protocol small scale before he activated it at Black Iron. That's why Jacob and Max are arguing at the beginning of the game. The Europa incident killed Danny's sister, and that's why she was after Jacob at the start of the game, knowing his transport had something to do with it. When Jacob regains composure, Danny can't go on anymore. The larva is getting to be too much to fight, so Jacob tells her to hang tight, and he rushes towards the warden's office, where Cole explains this has all gone according to plan. As mentioned before, this is all to pit humanity's survivor against his Alpha project, in a battle to the death, and prove his Alpha a success. The whole point of the organization trying to force human evolution is to help them expand humanity's life onto other planets without the needs for suits. That's why this project and its research on human adaptation are so crucial. Even if it fails, the organization learns something valuable through its research. This is also where the game's original PUBG setting comes into play. Survivors with the will to live in this game represent the sort of winners in that game. People who stay alive and fight till the end at all costs. That is what makes people like Captain Ferris and Jacob so important to the organization. The organization a stand-in for the type of people who set these sort of, battle royale situations up. That's the reason the organization's reach supposedly dates back centuries. The Alpha, of course, turns out to be Ferris, who's maintained his humanity and intelligence even when transformed. And Jacob does his best to fight back, but this time there is nowhere to go and he's clearly outmatched. But Ferris starts to mutate and transform, still retaining his humanity and consciousness, but his body has basically been destroyed. This gives Jacob enough time to free himself, and the final battle ensues. This Ferris Phase 2 boss fight has all the hallmarks of a horror boss, and melee is basically a no-fly zone from this point on. But it doesn't quite stick the landing. Aside from being extremely hard to disengage, heal, or anything like that, when you do enough damage to Ferris, he will call these exploding enemies for help. The issue being, again, that you're turning your back on him, which is basically you telling them game you'd like to reload the last checkpoint. The first time I played this, it was the most frustrating shit in the world, because you have to figure out how to kite around him, get some space, while not kiting yourself into an exploding enemy that you can't really turn to try to see, and it's just infuriating. On my second playthrough, when I kind of knew I should equip a faster weapon in one slot like the assault rifle or the pistol to clean up these exploders real quick, I got through this in one try. But the first time you play this game and you get here, it will leave you wondering what the fuck they were thinking. It's still not as fucking awful as the Code Veronica final boss, but it's pretty damn close. Once you do bring him down though, Jacob synthesizes the antidote, which I find hilarious, because when Ferris falls down he immediately walks over, gets close and starts extracting. Doesn't even check to see if he's still alive or anything. Which is wild, because Ferris dies with no real bang or explosion either. So Jacob, you might want to be a bit more cautious when walking over to the most dangerous thing you fought this entire game, and check to make sure it's really dead. Cole begs for the vial, because it's the key to all his research. He asks Jacob to just hand him the cure and head to the escape pod upstairs. But Danny shows up and tries to kill him to no avail thanks to the organization's supreme technology. They book it to the escape pods only to find out there's one left. So Jacob does what he's got to do and forces Danny into it, and ejects her off Callisto, just as her core finally completes its link with his, also sneaking and handing her the larva sample to use as evidence in the crimes on Callisto. Oh yeah. Hey, you know what this moment reminds me of?
No! No, don't you dare! Don't you dare launch the ship! Isaac! No. You don't know what you're doing!
I didn't. But I do now.
Hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all.
Oh, Jesus, what a fucking joke, Susie. Anyway, Jacob is stuck, and is again just fighting to stay alive at this point. But just when he's tired out and given up, Mahler radios him to tell him she's found a way out for the both of them, and we get the second best jump scare in the game. The first thing I did when I saw this was smile, because I knew exactly what this was.
Reactor 4 temporary savings activated.
But I'm going to need your help.
hey, how similar is Callisto to Dead Space? Well, it's not similar at all.
Comedy gold, son! And that's the game. I really like the Callisto Protocol. It's good, but it has some issues. There is work to be done here. There's refinement to be done in a sequel, but it is my kind of horror game. Focused on combat, ammo management, and surviving through skill, and not having shit aim. With hordes of enemies that can overwhelm you and do some gruesome stuff to you. Fans of Glen Schofield's work, for the most part, knew what they were getting. Clearly with the exception of some weird outliers that must have been hit on their head with a rock or something. And you can say maybe it's not the kind of horror game that you're into. There are a lot that I'm not. But one thing you can't really say is that the game lied to you about what it was going to be or something. They showed you exactly what it was in all the marketing. With that being said, yes, right now it does feel rushed and unfinished. Not because of something stupid like, oh, they didn't get everything about the combat or the mechanics down right 100% on their first try, and the game's not flawless, so it's trash. Which is honestly one of the dumbest trends that's been started by this whole wave of everyone and their grandpa grabbing a microphone and giving their gaming takes on this app. Constantly trying to scramble for some YouTube views by just saying they hate everything. But because of the things that the final release is lacking. Things like, oh, this mechanic isn't really working when this happens. We should adjust this and give the player options here. All that typically happens by releasing your game into the wild and refining. That's not something you can really polish out before release. That's something that you learn by trial and error through feedback. Resident Evil 1's original release, for example, plays like dog shit because of things like no auto-aim orientation, making you waste ammo, and other problems it has. Like having basically no ink ribbons or save points in the mines. But what did Capcom do? They looked at feedback, refined, and made Resident Evil 2. Back when Resident Evil 1 was made, other horror games weren't really doing what Resident Evil was doing, so it was rough around the edges. I mean, it feels rushed in its release date. All this emphasis on credits and upgrades, but no New Game Plus at launch? Come on now. I don't care if anything else got delayed. I don't care if anything else is supposed to be a post-launch update. New Game Plus should have launched with the game. Period. These kinds of single-player games live and die by their replayability and their fun factor. That's why a lot of Resident Evil games that focus more so on combat have New Game Pluses. Callisto has nothing like that right now. So even though I like the game, and I've played it through about twice, I don't want to start over my inventory every time I want to replay it. I basically have to wait until February to really touch the game again. And that's why I barely touch Resident Evil 7 compared to Resident Evil 8, that has a New Game Plus. Callisto is not perfect, but it is a good start. The most valuable feedback this game can get, like I said, is from people who have real constructive suggestions that refine the vision presented. Not Johnny Numbnuts' idea of what he wanted this game to be. Not, oh, make it less melee focused, but oh, here's what the melee system needs. I'm looking forward to not only DLC for this game, but what a from the ground up sequel can do now that they have a base to work with. Because Callisto is everything I look for in my horror game. A feeling that even when you are fighting back your hardest, you can still feel helpless by the sheer amount of things thrown your way. And one slip up can kill you in some of the worst ways. And my big three horror franchises I hail as gameplay from the good old days has become 4. I hope you guys enjoyed watching my take on things. Like I said, this was actually supposed to come after my Dead Space trilogy retrospective, but I procrastinated so long I decided to write this video up during my entire vacation, basically. I'll see you around.